Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. This December 10th, the world commemorates Human Rights Day for the 65th time. In that spirit, on today's After 10, we are joined by Lee Jung-hoon, ROK Ambassador for Human Rights, to talk about the efforts being undertaken by Korea to improve the human rights situation around the world. This December 10th marks the 65th anniversary of Human Rights Day, which commemorates the UN General Assembly's adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On today's After 10, we discuss the two major human rights issues affecting the Korean Peninsula: North Korean defectors and comfort women. Meet Lee Jung-hoon, the newly appointed Korean ambassador for human rights. Ambassador Lee, thank you very much for being on the program.
My pleasure.
Now, you've been appointed the Korean ambassador for human rights. Tell us a little bit about what your role is and what you're focusing on.
Well, usually when you think of ambassador, it's, say, Korean ambassador to the United States or to Japan or Malaysia or so. But there are, from administration to administration, several functional ambassadors. So ambassadors that take on a specific role in a specific area. In my case, it is the human rights area. Human rights is becoming a huge regime in the global context, so there's a lot to do. And basically, my position is to represent the Korean government, foreign ministry, to be more specific, and try my best to advertise Korea's position on certain human rights issue, and also participate in the global human rights regime representing the government.
Ambassadors for human rights, is this something that other countries do as well? Is this a common thing amongst other countries throughout the world?
No, it's not a common thing. It's only very few countries might have this. The United States, of course, has the human rights ambassador, but in the US, it's very specifically geared ambassador, meaning ambassador for North Korean human rights. That was possible because the United States in 2004 had already passed the North Korean Human Rights Act. And as part of that act, this position of ambassador for North Korean human rights was created. So somebody is assuming that position, and Robert King is fulfilling his duty as that. So it's a very rare and unique situation. And in my case, of course, North Korea takes the bulk sum of my activities. But having said that, I do cover a wide range of issues, such as comfort women and other aspects as well.
And we'll certainly get into those issues in a moment. Let's first talk about Human Rights Day. December 10th is Human Rights Day throughout the world, a day that commemorates the adoption of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Please, if you would, give us some background about that declaration and what it aimed to do back in 1948 when it was first established.
Well, December 10th, 1948, the UN decides to come up with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it has its foundation during World War II. The World War II has seen tremendous, tragic deprivation of human rights. I mean, it's wartime. And therefore, the Allied powers, so these are the good guys, decided that when the war is over, we have to do something about bringing about peace so that the world will no longer have that kind of violations of human rights. And the four things that really began to be talked about a lot were rights in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. So what are we talking about when we're talking about freedom from want? We're talking about basic necessities like shelter, food, medicine, that people should have a right to these basic fundamental things. So it's born out of the World War II desires of the Allied powers leaders, leading to the creation of the UN. And UN, of course, has the charter, which is sort of like the UN constitution. But to really put a focus and emphasis on human rights, in 1948, the UN decided to have this declaration of human rights in the universal context.
Highlighting the human rights issue back in 1948 following the war, let's look at the current situation today. Human Rights Day still holds a lot of significance, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are questions of, is the Universal Declaration legally binding? Well, in itself, it may not, but it has served as the foundation for many enactments of the international covenants and laws. Most specifically, of course, the 1966 International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. So these are the two brackets of human rights, and they encompass a very wide range of everything that you can list in human rights are packed into these covenants. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights serves as the founding principle and guideline for this covenant. And therefore, every year when come December 10th, we commemorate, we remember and commemorate this day as the Human Rights Day, and we try to advertise human rights. We try to address human rights issues that's very urgent, and we try to address that. And every 10 years or so, so every decade, the event becomes much more celebrated and big. Like, for example, in 2008, the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think we had a year-long celebration or events and conferences that took place.
Let's narrow our focus here on Korea and Korea's human rights issues. What are some of the more unique problems that Korea is facing these days?
Well, fortunately, in South Korea, we no longer have serious human rights issues. I mean, we've had them before, but we've overcome that, and we have become a mature democracy, and there really are no human rights issues as per se. So when we're talking about human rights in Korea, we're really talking about the peninsular issue and human rights violations in North Korea. And this is not just an issue for South Korea, but North Korean human rights issue has become a global issue. I mean, this is taken up. We've talked about the COI, but the UN, having observed the North Korean situation, has come to a point where it's saying, enough is enough. We cannot tolerate this in 2013. I mean, this shouldn't be going on. I mean, what we have is public execution. What we have is gulags, the political prison camps, where there are tens of thousands of people still locked up and incarcerated, and they're treated like worse than animals. There's forced abortions. People are being killed. Why do we have North Korean defectors? They're basically saying that there's no life in this country. So they're risking their lives to cross over the border into China to seek freedom and fundamental rights. So what we have is a really intolerable situation going on in North Korea, and that's when we're talking about Korean human rights issue. North Korean human rights issue really stands out at the forefront. There's another very sensitive and long-standing issue that has become also an international issue, and that's called the so-called comfort women issue. We're talking about during the Japanese colonial rule, the Japanese military operating the sexual slavery by force. These are not volunteers. I mean, some Japanese tend to come up with this claim that, there were volunteers and they were paid for, and therefore the Japanese government is not responsible. But that's not the case at all. The Japanese government was fully responsible, in many cases involuntarily forcing and kidnapping some of these young girls into sexual slavery, ruining their lives. And we do have some remaining women, the so-called comfort women, and their sort of grudge have not been atoned for yet. So there's no emotional reconciliation when it comes to these women, and that remains a homework. That remains an issue, an outstanding issue that needs to be resolved, and hopefully soon, because many of them are very advanced in their age.
Let's talk about these two issues, starting with the North Korean defector issue. We've seen many North Korean defectors over the past several months and years sent back to North Korea after trying to defect to, say, China or other countries as well. How is this issue being addressed as a human rights issue?
Well, it's a human rights issue because they're trying to escape from the political torture, political imprisonment, and they have every right to be considered as refugees. And once they are sent back, they're caught by the security forces of China, because their route, of course, is through mostly through across the river of Dumangang and Amnokgang through into China. The Chinese government's official position is not to grant them the status of refugees. They consider them as illegal aliens or illegal economic migrants. And therefore, the Chinese government puts on this claim that they have every right to send them back because they're illegal, and that they shouldn't be in China. But everyone knows that when they're sent back to China, they face, at best, imprisonment in the concentration camps, at worst, possible execution. So knowing exactly what they have to go through when they're sent back, and still sending them back is a blatant violation of human rights, and this shouldn't be taking place. And in human rights regime, there's a French word for that, non-refoulement. Knowing what faces them, you're not supposed to be sending them back, but they keep sending them back, and knowing fully well that they face tremendous predicament. So this is something that needs to be addressed by the international community, and hopefully China will come to senses soon and deal with this as a global leader ought to.
What expectations can we have for the COI recommendation to actually change what we're seeing there with North Korea? How can we expect things to actually change based on that recommendation?
Well, I mean, just the fact that this is not an NGO. This is the United Nations investigating. I mean, it does operate within a certain mandate. It's not like COI can indict certain North Korean perpetrators. But it is investigation, but it is trying to look into those people who are responsible for these acts that violates fundamental rights. So those people who may have ordered public execution, those people who may have been responsible for killing children and women, raping women in the political prison camps. So we're trying to come up with names. The COI is trying to come up with names and their exact acts, and we're hoping that the next stage after the COI's report in March will be that there's several steps forward, ultimately leading to possibly prosecution of some of these people who are responsible for these heinous acts, and also simply the fact that if you are in North Korea and let's say you are a guard in one of the gulags, political prison camps, and then all of a sudden you begin to hear that your name is floating around at the UN level, that people are, international community, not South Koreans, but the international community is beginning to talk about what you've done, how many people you've killed. That serves as a very powerful influence and I would say suppressant. So they would think twice before they commit other acts of violation of human rights. So I think it's a very, very powerful step that the United Nations is taking, and I hope it goes several steps further until there are changes made in North Korea.
The other major issue, human rights issue here on the Korean Peninsula would be the comfort women issue that you mentioned earlier. There are plenty of challenges to be tackled in coming to a resolution on this issue. What needs to be done to finally come to that resolution?
We need, we can't do it alone. This is not just up to the South Korean government. We need the cooperation of the Japanese government, because what some of these remaining comfort women, grandmas, basically, they don't want money. What use will money do at this compensation? These are really unnecessary aspects. What they want is peace of mind. And that peace of mind can only come about when they hear from the Japanese government officially that they've done these women wrong, great deal of injustice, that what they've done was terrible, and that they're sorry for it. And somehow that would sort of, reignite their dignity in a way, because they feel that their life's been ruined, and it has been ruined. And they still have, I go to meet with the remaining comfort women at the House of Sharing, where there are still several comfort women living together. So I go there quite regularly. And I sometimes bring a lot of the young students with me. And when they talk about these issues, it still, after all these years, bring tears to their eyes. And they still get very excited. They cannot hold their emotions because it's still very, very strong and powerful. And I think the Japanese government, despite the normalization of relations diplomatically and what have you, again, just like China, if Japan really wants to play a normal state role, if it really wants to, it's an economic giant, but compared to that, its political role in the global community is not huge. But if it really wants to play a genuine politically influential role in the global community, it has to come to terms with the past issues. Now, yes, back in 1993, Mr. Kono, who was at the time the cabinet minister, came up with a very nice statement. But thereafter, some prime ministers supported it, some prime ministers did not. Basically it's saying that we forced these women into sexual slavery, and and it apologizes for that. I really hope that the Japanese government take the leadership and take the issue one step further, and maybe even the prime minister coming to Korea and meeting some of these comfort women, just holding their hand and maybe shedding some tears and telling them, eye to eye, that they're terribly sorry for ruining their life. I think that's what it will take. And once that happens, right now there's a great deal of anti-Japanese sentiment here in Korea. But the moment that a political leader from Japan is able to do that, I think it will really turn around the South Korean people's emotions. And I think Korean-Japanese relations can turn around to a much more positive future.
And the South Korean government on this issue, what are they doing? And the question has to be asked, are they doing enough to resolve the comfort women issue?
Well, our president has been quite vocal on this issue. Our Minister for Gender and Equality was recently in the UN giving a speech about the comfort women issue. So, our government's been quite vocal about this issue, have been demanding the Japanese government. But I think, a dual approach has to be made. So on the one hand, sure, we take that approach in addressing this issue so that the international community would hear about it. The world has to know that there was such a thing. I think more and more people are becoming aware of this, and there are many international NGOs and governments that feel that Japan has done something terribly wrong, and it should own up to its responsibility. But at the same time, I think we have to deal with the Japanese political leaders on the side, so that that they can be persuaded. So a lot of persuasion needs to be made here, so that they can be persuaded to take the type of actions that we want them to take.
The North Korean defector issue and the comfort women issue, you mentioned these are the two major human rights issues on the Korean Peninsula. In a broader sense, though, South Korea, as you mentioned earlier, really has improved in human rights issues. The situation here in the country has improved. What is right now the present situation for human rights in South Korea?
Well, I think we're a model state when it comes to the maturation of democracy. I mean, looking back where we were several decades ago and where we are now. I mean, do we still see demonstrations on campus gates? No, we don't, because there are really no more human rights issues in this country. The human rights regime is huge now. I mean, this is one of the key elements, key topics that the UN treats, and it is growing. And I hope that South Korean government is able to jump on board and really be a very active participant in this international human rights regime, and also take the initiative in many of the issues that's being discussed. Not just, I mean, of course, for Korea, the North Korean human rights violations, comfort women, these are really key issues. But at the same time, I think we have to, lend some sympathetic ears to a lot of the human rights issues that's going on in Africa, in other continents. And I hope that, eventually the direction of my government will be that, we play such an active, initiative-taking role in the international human rights regime.
And your ultimate goal as ROK Ambassador for Human Rights, what is it?
I think that's too ambitious. But I just hope to make some contributions in the direction of my government in terms of the human rights policy comes. And I hope that we really expand the scope of what my government, how my government deals with these human rights issues. As Ambassador for Human Rights of Korea, I hope to certainly deal with the North Korean human rights issues and comfort women issues, but at the same time, it will be very good for me or for my successors down the line to be actively participating in the human rights issues of, say, Syria, Congo, or other parts of the world. I think that will be very reflective and commensurate to what we hope to be as a global power in the global community.
Ambassador Lee, these are weighty issues, very important issues as well. Thank you very much for coming on the show and talking with us about them.
You're very welcome.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.